What's up, guys? Welcome to Movie Emporium's Flashback Reviews, where I take movies from the past, break them down, and tell you what I think about them. If you like what you see, of course, hit the subscribe button. Join Movie Emporium, hit that notification bell at the top to find out what's coming next, and comment below on any video that you watch on my channel. So we continue our journey to No Time to Die, which is Daniel Craig's last film as James Bond, and we head into 1969 with literally 2 years after You Only Live Twice came out. Sean Connery had officially retired at this point, and they had to find a new actor to play James Bond. Well, they were actually going to bring in Roger Moore to play James Bond, and they were going to do a completely different movie. But he was busy. He was committed to doing The Saint, so they had to find a different actor. And they found a commercial actor named George Lazenby to fill in the role, and they offered him a 7-picture deal, which is pretty crazy for a commercial actor. And I think after shooting this film, after he saw the kind of work he had to put into this role, I think he just wasn't ready for it. I think he just wasn't up to snuff. And at the behest of his agents, he was literally said no. So this is the only film as James Bond. And to be fairly honest, I think this is a very vulnerable James Bond. I think this is a very undervalued James Bond. I think it's a very realistic character that is given a kind of a cool romantic arc. He's given a more realistic look into a character that works for MI6. And I think George Lazenby, for better or worse, is actually pretty decent in this movie for, the stilted dialogue and stuff like that. But the movie, of course, is called On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This movie brought in Peter R. Hunt, who was the editor for most of the Bond films, as director. And I think that gave it an advantage because he's able to kind of command his shots based off how he edits. And I think it really works because I think this movie really flows better. I think it feels better than most of the other Bond films. And I think it makes more sense than the other Bond films, which isn't saying that the Sean Connery Bond films don't make any sense. I just think as an editor, when you see what he's doing and how he's pacing everything, and using John Glenn, who actually became later on as a director for the Bond films, for other Bond films, I think he does actually a great job. And I think this movie is very undervalued. I think it's very underrated. I think it's a movie that a lot of people should watch because I think you would appreciate what is going on here. And I think it has one of the best action sequences in the Bond franchise. And it's really fascinating to see. But this story is also very simple for being 2 hours and 22 minutes. It doesn't have the most substantial plot in the entire history of the Bond franchise. I think at this point, I think Goldfinger does. But the story of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, basically Bond saves this countess, played by Diana Rigg, who plays Countess Tracy, and he starts to develop a romantic relationship, and which carries throughout the movie to the eventual conclusion. And he basically uses her to get to her father, who is played by Gabriele Ferzetti, who plays Count Draco, and Count Draco is a crime warlord. And because of the romantic attraction that James Bond has to Countess Tracy, he offers information to where Blofeld and Spector are hiding, which is in Switzerland. So he disguises himself as, a doctor or whatever. He heads to Switzerland where he meets Blofeld, who's played by Telly Savalas. And he is basically entwined into the plot of this movie, which is basically seeing James Bond having to stop Blofeld, who is basically trying to create bioterrorism destruction of the entire United States population, world, or whatever you want to call it, by basically making everything sterile, which I thought was kind of interesting because I'm not saying, because this came out in 1969, the Robert Langdon book, Inferno, kind of inspires by this, which is really fascinating because it's, like I said, about sterilization of the whole entire world. Like nothing will be able to repopulate, which is it's really outlandish, but it's kind of unique and a little more grounded than what Blofeld has been known for, which is like nuclear war and stealing bombs and stuff like that. But it takes place, like I said, in Switzerland, so there's gonna be skiing involved, and basically there's these characters called the Angels of Death, which are these really attractive women that Bond sleeps with and just finds very attractive. He is basically sleeping his way through the angels. But they're being brainwashed. They're being used by Blofeld to basically take these devices and spread them around the world to cause the sterilization. And that's interesting. That's very unique and very kind of cool and weird and kind of just interesting. And I kind of love it for that. I think it kind of sucks that Donald Pleasance wasn't brought back, but Telly Savalas does a really competent job, and I think he's actually more interesting than Donald Pleasance in some points. I think his uniqueness and his global domination and his way of thinking is more just on point in this movie than it is in most of the other movies. And he just seems more of a realistic villain, for better or worse. But I love Telly Savalas in this movie. I think he's a lot of fun. I think when he squares off against Bond, I think it's a check versus checkmate situation, and I think eventually it's going to play out to the point where James Bond's going to win. But it has a really interesting conclusion, which I'll get to in a second. Now, with that said, with this plot moving along, Bond, like I said, is very grounded in this movie. There's literally no gadgets in this movie. Desmond Llewelyn, who is in this movie, is more of like a center focus in a couple scenes, but he's never offering gadgets to Bond. They're trying to make him more of a sleuth and a detective and a debonair, suave guy than a guy who's just using what Roger Moore did in a lot of his movies, and Pierce Brosnan, Timothy Dalton, and even Sean Connery, which is just use a lot of gadgets to his advantage. But that doesn't happen here. This is just a movie that is just showing a character who is on the edge of quitting MI6, which is pretty insane. And he gets involved with like anger issues with Bernard Lee, who plays M, and Miss Moneypenny, Lois Maxwell, is very like into James Bond, as we see in most of these movies. And when she sees how the eventual marriage of James Bond and Countess Tracy, it actually affects her, which is really kind of a unique storytelling point. But like I said, this movie is really dark. There is a lot of violence going on in this movie that is really uncomfortable to watch. There's a lot of weird stuff in this movie as well, where we see James Bond holding a Playboy, and he basically walking around with a centerfold in a building with a whole bunch of people. So he's just reading it, and he's folding up the pages as he's walking by a couple of women. It's a very strange thing. But just to watch James Bond and how he reacts to everything, how he interacts with everything. There is a sequence where James Bond is basically being attacked by some people. These people that tried to attack Countess Tracy, and how he handles it, how the violence plays out, is just extremely dark. This is something that doesn't really, at least up to this point, to my recollection, doesn't really play out until maybe like Casino Royale, to the darkness that James Bond is willing to go to. And there are points in this movie where it's just James Bond is going to do whatever it takes to take down Blofeld and these villains. And it's just a lot of fun to watch, but you're just like uncomfortable through most of it. You're like, oh my God, they're really going to places and really dark moments. And it's just a really interesting kind of weird thing to talk about with James Bond, who does go to dark places. It's like a real stepping stone for James Bond, kind of given a real kind of character moment and character arc, which I think is a lot of fun. And I think also the grounded realism in this movie just really helps it a lot. I think the fact that though this movie is 2 hours and 22 minutes, which is a little longer than it should be, I think it should be around 2 hours long. I think just the suaveness of, George Lazenby and what he's doing, I think how everything is playing out, I just think it's a really entertaining movie. And then it leads to like this snow chase through, basically there's a skiing snow chase in this movie, which is like the true main action set piece, because there's not a lot of set pieces or anything going on in this movie. It's more just kind of James Bond going from place to place to place, which might bother a lot of people. But I think the snow chase sequence is really fascinating, and it's really interesting because Christopher Nolan is very inspired by this movie apparently, as well as Steven Soderbergh. I think they're inspired because of the darkness of the nature of the character, because they're really showing what James Bond truly is, which is a killer. And you can also see it in Inception, Christopher Nolan's film, where there is like that whole sequence in the snow and the skiing and stuff like that. And you can tell that's completely inspired by On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because the way the angles are shot, the vistas, the way everything's placed is very kind of just awe-inspiring. It's very cool. And, Blofeld ends up triggering an avalanche, which is really fun to watch. Yeah, a lot of it's against projection screens, but that was the era that they were filming with. And it's just really fun, really exciting. The gunplay is really cool. The fact that Countess Tracy and Bond are running for their lives down a ski slope as Blofeld and his people are kind of chasing after them. It's just a great action set piece that falls into a bobsled sequence, which is even more entertaining to watch, because James Bond is chasing after Blofeld, is trying to escape, and he is doing everything in his power, and then all of a sudden Blofeld's bobsled kind of crashes, and he finds himself in James Bond's bobsled, and he ends up getting caught into a tree. And it's just a lot of fun to watch, and a really exciting sequence, and it just leads into some kind of an emotional fun and excitement and enjoyable nature of what James Bond truly is. And I think, on top of that, just watching how James Bond plays his character arc out, how Telly Savalas plays his character arc as Blofeld, and how realistic and kind of down to earth it is, I think it just makes for On Her Majesty's Secret Service as being one of the best Bond films. And then, you have John Barry, who is doing the score for this movie. And it's really a unique, different score. It's completely different from James Bond outside of the themes that he uses. And then we have Louis Armstrong, who is doing All the Time in the World, or You Have All the Time in the World, or something like that. And it's not even the main theme of the movie. It's actually played in the middle of the movie when James Bond is basically romancing Countess Tracy. And there's like this whole cool sequence of kind of like romancing Countess Tracy, and Louis Armstrong's song is playing through that. And I love Louis Armstrong. I think he's a great singer and composer and so on and so forth. So it's really great to see him do a song in here. And it's a great song too. So it's really fascinating. But this movie leads into some really, really dark territory at the very end. We think Blofeld's pretty much dead because he kind of hung himself on a tree. So in between the two set pieces, after Bond and Count Draco have defeated Blofeld, there's a sequence where basically James Bond tells Countess Tracy that he's in love with her and proposes marriage. She says yes. And then we get to the very end of the film where the two have become married. And I think that's a really interesting, fun way to tie up a Bond character, at least in this role that, George Lazenby's playing, because it gives it kind of a cool closure. It gives Bond a new feel. But then Blofeld, we find out, is alive. He's in a neck brace, and his second in command is driving the car. And as Countess Tracy and James Bond are stopped on the side because James Bond wants to take all the flowers off the car, they shoot up the car. Blofeld and his second in command, they shoot up the car, and basically James Bond is going to go chase after him. But he realizes that Countess Tracy has been shot and killed. That point in that movie is probably what broke people, because there isn't a lot of Bond films that end on a dire note like that. In the sea of the shock and despair that James Bond is going through at that point, I think it's a stroke of genius. I think it's very bold. I think it's very unique, and gives us a Bond character that is similar to what Daniel Craig ends up happening to him in Casino Royale, where it gives us an emotionally broken character. But because George Lazenby didn't come back, this movie ends up feeling like a different world James Bond, like a different universe, like an infinite universe style of James Bond, where it doesn't feel like it fits into the style of what James Bond is in the later films. So it's like its own weird reality. And like I said, I wish George Lazenby had come back, because I think they could have taken that emotional arc of his character and kind of done something really unique with it. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And it's such a shame. And I think it's something that was kind of a missed opportunity. But, George Lazenby did what he had to do. And I think he ended up missing out on an opportunity that could have been really successful in his career. But yeah, this movie is just, I love this movie. I think it's one of the best Bond films. It's a film that I haven't seen for a very long time, but I've always talked to people and they've always agreed with me that this film is very underrated. And it does stuff that is very unlike James Bond. It does stuff that very grounds and is very realistic for James Bond, and doesn't give us the James Bond gadgets, like I said. And I love it for that. I think it's a great film. I think it does some really unique stuff. And I think George Lazenby doesn't get enough credit that he deserves. And I think this is a movie that I definitely highly recommend. It's a little long, like I said, but it's a great James Bond film. So, but that's it. That's my take on Her Majesty's Secret Service. If you haven't seen it, please do. Let me know in the comments below. If you have seen it, let me know what you think of it. I know most people probably will hate this movie, but anyways, thank you so much for watching. Please hit that subscribe button to join Movie Emporium. Hit that notification bell at the top to find out what's coming next. And we'll see you on the next film, which is Diamonds Are Forever, which brings back Sean Connery for his last film. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on the next film. Peace out. What's up, guys? Thank you so much for checking out Movie Emporium. I really appreciate it. If you want to, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification button and the bell at the top. Find out what's coming next for Movie Emporium. Also, check out these two videos. They're amazing. I think they're awesome. I think you'll enjoy them too. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.